This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential. Today we're going to cover the book The Republic by Plato. As for who recommended the book, well, you can take your pick. There have been many people over the millennia that have recommended this book, but the one we're picking out of Tools of Titans is Maria Popova, who is best known for her blog, which has millions of readers, started with a mailing list that she regularly sent to friends and has expanded well beyond that. The blog is brainpickings.org, features writing on culture, books, philosophy, all sorts of other stuff. Well worth the read. You can also find Maria via social media of your choice in different ways. But, of course, brainpickings.org is the place to go for her. And I believe, Eric, you had something you wanted to read as far as her explanation for why she recommended this book.
Yeah, here's what she said about the book when asked if she could guarantee that every public official or leader read one book. And here's where she comes in. The book would be rather obviously Plato's The Republic. I'm actually gobsmacked that this isn't required in order to be sworn into office, like the Constitution is required for us American immigrants when it comes time to gain American citizenship. So that was her thought. And she was the one person in Tools of Titans that recommended this, and that was why. So you want to hit about the author?
Yeah, why are you going to turn this over to me?
Well, you have been teaching Plato for the last 13 years, correct?
Something like that. I mean, that's through other means, not necessarily direct Plato classes, but yeah. Anyway, the author, Plato, an Athenian, a philosopher in ancient Athens, who was a follower. He came after Socrates, or as, of course, one of my high school history teachers insisted on saying until I corrected him, and then he insisted that I was not right until he then went and asked our Latin teacher at that school about it and was corrected. He insisted that it was Socrates. It's like, who in the world is he talking about? Oh, Socrates. Oh, yeah. So yeah, I don't think after our class he made that mistake anymore, but I don't know how many times he taught different classes about Socrates, but this is, of course, one of the people referenced in The Princess Bride, another bastion of great wisdom. Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Anyway, widely understood as the founder, effectively, of the modern discipline of philosophy. There's the old statement that all philosophy is simply footnotes to Plato at this point, that everybody is just riffing off of what Plato put together after, of course, having been taught by Socrates. In any case, Plato founded the Academy in Athens, which you, I suppose, could loosely call the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. But basically, Western philosophy and science and everything else ultimately gets its roots has its roots in some way, shape, or form. Its roots eventually touch Plato. So everything that anyone ultimately talks about in the English language, even though we're not talking the same language he did, all of basically everything all of our assumptions and various philosophical principles and everything in some way, shape, or form do go back and touch Plato. So one of the most foundational thinkers in world history. I don't think I mentioned his time frame, but born in the late 5th century BCE, wrote up until his death around the mid 4th century BCE. Quite a bit had happened in Athens during that time, including Athens going from a pure democracy to tyranny, which significantly influenced Plato's perspective on this. And of course, he watched his teacher Socrates be convicted of perverting the youth, or basically polluting the youth, leading them astray with his philosophizing, and sentenced to death. So he was very skeptical about the nature of pure democratic government and of tyranny and all sorts of things. And of course, you get a lot of those reflections in this book, in the mouth of course, Socrates, who is his muse more often than not, as he writes dialogues. Everything that Plato writes down is not actually he doesn't write down his own thoughts, even though they, as far as we can tell, he's giving us his own perspectives on things by shaping things the way that he does. But he consistently presents his material in the mouth of other people, particularly Socrates, who then is in dialogue with other people. So you get these dialogues, of which the most famous is, of course, the Republic. So I suppose that's a lengthy enough introduction, perhaps a little bit over lengthy. But let's go ahead and get to overview and initial reactions.
Yeah, and this should be interesting because you're very familiar with the work, and this is the first time I'd ever read it, so I recognized parts of it, and especially the cave part. I remember that part.
The allegory of the cave.
But yeah, my first time reading it, and I always have trouble with these kind of books, and so I tried to take it slow. I even had some trouble with the translation. I started with Everyman's Library version, and it was kind of slogging through it. So I switched to whatever version was on the iPad, the iBooks version, and not sure what the difference in translation was there, but seemed to have an easier time getting through that. So stuck with that one through the
translations end. Are for the weak.
Do you read it in the original?
I did not read through this in the original for this particular Books of Titans episode, though
but you have in the past.
I have spent my share of time working through Plato, various dialogues of Plato in Greek. Though actually, really, I don't know that I've messed with the Republic all that much. I think I've tinkered with a few things in it, but I did a seminar in graduate school. I did a seminar on the where we translated the Symposium, and then we did a Neoplatonism seminar, which involved translation of all sorts of stuff, from Platonic works to up through Plotinus, who was a later thinker in the Platonic tradition. So I think we did mostly the Timaeus in terms of the Greek there, but I think when I was going through the Republic for that, we may have tinkered a little bit with it, but I don't really remember much.
Yeah. Well, initial reaction to the book, it was really interesting in that a lot of what we saw and have seen in some of the other Books of Titans books are common themes in this one, and I guess I didn't expect those things to be in this book, so
wisdom is
cool.
all just footnotes to Plato, man.
Yeah, yep. And so we'll discuss those things, but that was cool. But yeah, as you mentioned, it follows the Socratic method of answering the question: is it more profitable or advantageous to be just or unjust? That's kind of the question at the beginning of the book, and then the Plato's method of not telling you what to think, but doing that in a different way of asking questions. And
he does tell you what to think.
Yeah, but not straightforward. He does it through asking questions and then getting you to think about it instead of just, well, here's what you should think. So that was cool, and yeah, that's the main gist from the beginning. Is it more profitable or advantageous to be just or unjust?
And I want to jump in here real quick, rather than giving my initial reactions, which I think it's a little late for that. But rather than giving those, it's worth noting a couple things. One is that you often hear about the Socratic Method, particularly people talking about, oh, I prefer to teach through the Socratic Method. I like to have my students, I like to ask questions of my students and let them figure things out and all this. Oftentimes, what people think is the Socratic Method these days is a little different from what Socrates actually employs in the dialogues, and what we see used throughout Plato's dialogues in general, in part because the Socratic Method is not so much, I'm just going to ask questions and let people figure it out. He's actually asking very pointed, leading questions that he has he has specific things in mind that he's trying to get people towards, a particular vision, a particular argument in mind. And this is really more a style of argument, more so than just a style of teaching. Although, as it turns out, it's a better way to teach than other forms of argument. So if you just argue a particular point without any sort of interaction, the person may not actually be as willing to follow. But if you can get that person to answer, well, yeah, of course, that makes sense, and then then you can lead them by degree to your conclusions, and then giving them opportunities to come in and object and so on. At which point you can lead down another line of questioning. It turns out to be a much more difficult means, a much more difficult kind of a style of argument to argue against, which is one of the reasons that of course, Plato employed these in the dialogues, and it does appear that it's probably likely that Socrates employed precisely this kind of argumentative style, which made him so frustrating for people to argue with. The second thing here that's worth noting, many of our listeners are probably, just given that we're speaking in English and in the United States, and most of our listeners are from the United States, are probably familiar with concepts in the Bible, particularly the New Testament and the Christian tradition, concepts of righteousness and unrighteousness. Now, it's worth noting that the words for righteous or unrighteous are the words that are in Erik's edition of the Republic and most editions of the Republic, and what we will be discussing on this podcast are translated with the words just or unjust. So righteous is just and unjust is unrighteous. And in large measure, these terms, by the time they get to the New Testament period, are understood in the Hellenistic world, in the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament. They're understood very much in keeping with the kinds of arguments that are made here in Plato about what is justice, what is injustice, what characterizes a just person versus an unjust person, and all of that. So that, for those of you who haven't read this book and do come from that tradition, it's also worth reading this book in part because of how it's actually part of that discussion that the New Testament and the Christian tradition later joins as well, and later has its own ways of developing. So worth noting.
Well, and that's one question I wanted to ask you on this book too, is how much of an influence did this book have in Jerusalem? Like, would Paul have read this book?
I would have been shocked. I would be shocked if Paul did not have firsthand knowledge of the Republic, given that he had some degree of Greek education, writing Greek reasonably well, arguing in Greek, being a Hellenistic Jew, and again, he claims to be from a province of a Greek-speaking province in what is now modern-day Turkey. His education would have started with learning some Homer and certainly some Plato, and this would have been among the repertoire that you would have gained fairly early on in this sort of thing. So I would be shocked if he didn't have good knowledge of it, and even if he didn't read it directly, this was so in the air among any educated Greek speaker that you couldn't avoid it. and the concepts here were in the air in the same way that that modern American philosophical concepts and so on are in the air. I mean, this is the stuff that people would talk about and define the way that the terms were used in his period. So yeah, and actually, there's some evidence that even rabbinic literature and other things that were done in other languages had, there's good research out there that shows that they were ultimately shaped and they were influenced to some degree by exposure to the ideas in Plato and other Hellenistic other works from the Hellenistic philosophical tradition. Which again, after Alexander, you got to remember Alexander the Great conquered the ancient Near East all the way to the border of India, and the intelligentsia in that region spoke Greek forever after that, for a long time, for 1,000 years, basically. And he spread Greek education, partly because Alexander's tutor, when he was a teenager, was Aristotle, who was one of Plato's students. So from that point on, these sorts of things were taught in cities across the Greek-speaking empire, which... various Greek-speaking empires, actually, that splintered after Alexander died, but they were divided up among Greek speakers. So all the way through that whole area of the world, this stuff was taught in the gymnasia and in the various early stages of any literate Greek speaker's education.
Okay, very cool. Especially the connection with righteousness and being just, and unrighteousness and unjust.
Yeah, injustice is unrighteousness, and justice is righteousness. I mean, they're the same word, dikaiosune, and the negatives of thereof. All right.
Okay. So let's go into our next section of our favorite quotes.
Quotes.
I think you've got some more than me, so why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay. So the highest reach of injustice is to be deemed just when you are not. That's a good one. I like that one. Yeah, and it's pretty much true. When someone gains the reputation of being just when they're not. That's pretty much the epitome of injustice.
Yeah.
I guess I'll do one more. Pleasure deprives a man of the use of his faculties quite as much as pain, which runs counter to the way that we often think, but I think it's absolutely true. And he gives several examples of this. Having a little bit of drink can be pleasurable. You have too much of the pleasurable thing, and you actually lose your capacity to enjoy it.
My first one, whereas the truth is that the state in which the rulers are most reluctant to govern is always the best and most quietly governed, and the state in which they are most eager, the worst. And that just makes me think of that scene in the movie Gladiator where Marcus Aurelius' son comes up to him and he says, Marcus Aurelius says, are you ready to lead? And he says, yes. And Marcus Aurelius says, then you're not ready. Whereas the gladiator in the film, when asked that same question, he says, no, I'm not ready to lead. And Marcus Aurelius says, then you are ready to lead.
Of course, that can go the other way, that you may just know that you're not ready.
Yeah.
But if you are eager to lead, odds are... Well, yeah. Anyway, let's see. Oh, then there's so much humor in this. I mean, Plato's dialogues are underrated for their humor. That if you have any idea of some of the backstory of some of these little quips, are quite funny. And they remain funny 2,000 years later. All you have to do is change the terms just a little bit to more modern terms, and they continue to be funny. But here we go. If a man is to be in condition, would you allow him to have a Corinthian girl? as his fair friend. Yeah, that's just hilarious. That, given the reputation of Corinthian girls and Corinthian women, this is Corinth, just to put it in perspective, at least from the perspective of the Athenians and generally speaking other parts of the world at this time, and for quite a while after this, Corinth had a reputation as sort of the Las Vegas of the world when it came to morals, or maybe more just the area outside Las Vegas in Nevada, where, you go for girls of certain reputation. And, if you want a man to be in good condition, do you really want him to be wasting all his strength with a Corinthian girl? Anyway, I find that one funny, maybe more than some listeners would. And then a second one, since I'm doubling up, since I have about twice as many as you do on here, one that's appropriate to both of us here. I am quite aware that the mere athlete becomes too much of a savage, and the mere musician is melted and softened beyond what is good for him. There we go.
Nice. All right, my next one. Because a free man ought not to be a slave in the acquisition of knowledge of any kind. Bodily exercise, when compulsory, does no harm to the body, but knowledge, which is acquired under compulsion, obtains no hold on the mind. So that reminds me of a lot of my early education, especially with books, having to read books that under compulsion is not the same as wanting to read them and reading them later in life out of the joy of reading. So that one struck home.
Yeah, so another one for me, again, somewhat humorous, and I'm actually just going to quote part of it because it's funnier if you just quote the first half of it. Then let the wives of our guardians strip. Now, yes, it's a little bit, it's a little out of context, and it's not the full thing, but it actually does kind of get to where he's going. He and then he explains that, we may have some scruples about that now, but, we used to think that male nudity was a bad thing, but now an experience showed that to let all things be uncovered was far better than to cover them up. We're much more enlightened. So, hey, all right. And then finally, actually two that are less funny, and just, more, brilliant. The honorable mind, which is to form a healthy judgment, should have had no experience or contamination of evil habits when young. Vice cannot know virtue too, but a virtuous nature, educated by time, will acquire a knowledge of both virtue and vice. And so those two quotes together, I think, is a brilliant insight that basically, as a person engages in vice, that person loses the ability to distinguish between virtue and vice. But a person who is virtuous can actually tell the difference. So that's a pretty good insight, I think.
Yeah. My last one is for as the government is, such will be the man. And this gets into a lot of the discussion in this book, which I thought was really cool on later on the founding of a city and what that means. Something I haven't really ever thought of. But a lot of talk about how as the individual is, so is the state, and as the state is, so is the individual. So making sure both parts there are in agreement. And so this quote hit on that.
Alrighty, so let's go ahead and get into our nitty gritty here, and we'll work our way out. So you had some initial stuff here. You wanted to touch on some common themes.
Yeah, things that I saw that we've seen in some of the other Books of Titans books. One that I was very surprised to see here was the issue of specialization. And Plato talked about specializing in a particular field, particular job. And the reason being, which I hadn't seen in some of the other books that talk about specializing, the reason to take advantage of opportunities. Because the more you specialize, the more you dig down into something, the more that you're going to be aware of opportunities coming your way, and especially in that area. So I thought that was a cool thing that he got into in regards to that. And then also the well-lived whole life, which we definitely saw in Deep Survival. Not just hoping that things work out in a moment of crisis, but living each day and all the way to the end of your days, where in Deep Survival they talked about seeing how a man dies, how a person dies, to fully gauge their life. And Plato talked a lot about that in this book. One other thing in some of your quotes, Jason, got into this, but he talked a lot about the guardians of the city, so those who were responsible for protecting the city, and the importance of honor of those people. And I guess it was interesting to read that, because most of the time you kind of hear of the bad things that soldiers get into when they're in their life of being a soldier, kind of the more bad behavior side of things they can do, but to read this and to see how important it was for the honor of the guardians of the city, I thought that was really cool. So what are some of your things that I guess one that stuck out to you, but then also things that really stick out to your students when you teach this?
Well, I mean, one of the main things that I always end up dealing with is this idea of the tripartite soul that he addresses. That, you know, he divides the soul. So much of this book is, and you hit this in one of your favorite quotes, actually, that, you know, as is the let's see, what is it? As the government is, such will be the man. He also talks about that the ideal state is a macrocosm it's a large picture of how each individual person is. So each individual is made up of the same kinds of components that you'd want the ideal state to do. And so really, when he's talking about, you know, the ideal state, he's actually talking about the ideal human, right? The way that the ideal man works. And he divides this into three categories, three specific levels of a human, where you've got the level of the guardian, essentially, for the city, you know, for the state or the city. You have three classes. You have the guardians that are the sort of philosopher/warrior class. They're the smallest class in the city, but they provide for the self-control of the few. So basically, they live according to moderation. As Plato says, the desires of the inferior many are controlled by the wisdom and desires of the superior few. So you have this moderation that is exhibited by these philosophers at the top that governs the whole city. And this is the equivalent in the human being of the mind, right? The mind that can contemplate eternal realities and the fixed order of things and all that. That is and it's the part that allows us to make good, rational choices. But it's also the smallest part, but that's the part that should be governing things ultimately for human beings. Then you have the auxiliary part, which he talks about as soldiers. They're kind of the supporting arm of the guardians, and they're trained to be soldiers and so on. And then after them, you have the third part, which is actually the largest part, and that is the money-making part of the city or the state. And, you know, that's where your merchants, your craftsmen, your various artisans of all sorts operate in that class. And it's by far the largest class and all this, but it's kept in order by the guardians through the auxiliaries, through the military class, basically, or the police class, as it were. And basically, those classes have their respective corresponding parts in the human soul with the heart or the chest, the auxiliary. That's the soldiers, the part that that with which a human being can get angry. It also is the part that ultimately makes decisions on. You can reason things out, but you have to make your decisions somehow, and ultimately you do that basically with that spirited part, that chest part of you, your heart. And then you have the part that has and he gets into this later in the book where he spells this out much more once he starts talking about the tyrant and all this, that the lower part of the body is the money-making, it's the desirous part, the appetitive part, the part that has desires for sensual stuff, whether that's eating, drinking, etc. So ultimately, it's the money-making apparatus for the city. It's the part that is out to increase and all this, but it's the part that needs to be regulated the most by those who have the philosophical rationale at the top. And of course, this is his model for how the human being should work. That humans have this potentially disordered animal aspect of them by being embodied, your gut and your genitals and all this. They want what they want, and it doesn't really matter that it's not right or that it's not rational, and that needs to be kept in order by the mind. And ultimately, that central part helps make that decision. So basically the spirited part, the emotions, are the helper of the rational part. So that's that heart part. Now, for those of you out there who are familiar with C.S. Lewis, he actually spends a good amount of time explaining this tripartite soul part in modernizing it to some degree in the book The Abolition of Man, which is one of my favorite books actually from the 20th century, where he actually makes the argument that that modern education and the way that modern philosophy is going about things is making, as he calls them, men without chests. We're making we're training people up to have great knowledge and all this, but without adequately training that central part of the soul to make good decisions and to help the rational part in that way. And he says ultimately that leads away, this is why he calls it the abolition of man, leads away from the fundamental humanness of the person. So anyway, all that's very interesting. It's also to some degree the source of what we see later on develop with Sigmund Freud. Freud has his own tripartite model. He just doesn't use the words that Plato does for them. He has ego, id, and superego, but by and large, the corresponding parts kind of map right onto what Plato's doing. And maybe Freud wasn't quite as clever as people think he was. He was just essentially modernizing Plato and adding maybe a few additionally perverse twists when he was on his cocaine binges and such when he was high on cocaine and writing. So yeah, there's that. Anyway, so that's one of the things that I think is really worth understanding for this, because that notion of the tripartite soul and the way that that human beings sort of work against themselves, right? That you can assent, you can feel like you want something and that you don't want something at the same time. And he addresses this by this idea that there must be different parts in the human being, divided in the soul and the will that actually impact this. So it's been a tremendously influential view and a really generative view in philosophy since this was written.
Well, and there's also talk of the afterlife, and that the question that the book addresses at the beginning of, is it more profitable or advantageous to be just or unjust? That question is ultimately answered in Plato's terms by the gods. So it's not just something that can be answered here, but it's kind of that view again of the person's whole life. And then that being judged by the gods or in the afterlife. So that was also interesting. I mean, I know that comes in a lot of cultures, but was interesting to see it, I guess, in kind of this foundational book of philosophy.
Yeah, no doubt. And the interesting. It's also interesting to hear his criticism of the traditional myths of his particular culture and time as unjust and wrongly portraying the gods by and thereby leading people astray to do unjust things because the gods are so unjust. And he says, we need better myths, we need better stories for the to tell people, to train them up to do this stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, that hits on one of the more, I guess, difficult themes of the book as well. Getting rid of certain stories or getting rid of ideas in order to guide people a certain way. Yes, our modern version of burning books type of idea. Talk in the book of a rule by the elite, even while acknowledging that there's a lot of problems of philosophers. Some eugenics discussion, and then
we got to have the women and children in common. Don't forget that part, because you don't want people, having, especially with the guardian class, you don't want any of the guardians having their own families, or they might start having desires to start looking after their own, and then not the city. So then you end up with divisions that lead to discord in the city, and then nobody's happy eventually. So you've got to make sure that everybody has, at least in the guardian class, shared women and children in the guardian class, and they draw their partners for a time by lot. So,
yeah,
he admits that would be difficult to execute.
Some uncomfortable themes when you're reading this book, but nevertheless, a good one to read.
Yep.
So,
yep.
Anything else before we close out?
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple other things. I mean, there's lots of interesting stuff in terms of, the knowledge versus opinion. Opinion acts as the auxiliary class to the intellect. So, in the same way that you have the mind and you have the auxiliary class of the heart, or, the spirited part, the helper of the rational part, opinion is the intermediate between the mere physical appearances, and knowledge itself. Knowledge is in a eternal sense. It's something that is connected with that which is truly real and is is beyond the things of this world and the material. But opinion actually serves as the intermediate when with the representatives in this world. So now this is actually a break with Parmenides, who came before Plato, who said that opinion was entirely worthless, and all that mattered was that eternal knowledge. And Plato says, no, opinion actually has its place. You have to be able to go through the world in a certain way, and knowledge is in one domain, and in the domain of the becoming rather than being, in the stuff that's changing over time and all that. Opinions have jurisdiction in that spot. The stuff that floats between existence and non-existence, that's changing all the time. You have to deal with those ambiguities, and opinion's worth that. So it's interesting to see there. There's also a good amount of discussion of the good, the principle of the good, and you see this become really big in the Platonic tradition of the good and the beautiful, and in continued discussion there. So yeah, that there's plenty of additional stuff that we could discuss beyond that, but yeah, this could very easily go on for hours and hours and hours, and it's probably all I can say is that everybody should read this book. And whether it is whether ultimately we agree with it entirely or not in different spots, it has a way of critiquing even the modern world in ways that are in some cases kind of shocking how insightful it can be, even down to the dangers of democracy and leading towards tyranny by basically elevating the worst, who are the most eager for power and all of these other things, and then that person eventually it proceeds into tyranny. And it turns out that historically, he's got a pretty good case for this in terms of how governments give way one to another. And some of this is because he'd seen some of this in his own day, but this is where a lot of the framers of the U.S. Constitution got a lot of their ideas in terms of trying to limit the branches of government and separation of power and skepticism about human nature and all this other stuff. A lot of that stuff comes straight out of the Republic. One other quote I should throw in there too: "Any musical innovation is full of danger to the whole state and ought to be prohibited." I think that's
look at what rock and roll did to the world.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to maybe leave off.
The bad musical innovation. Yeah. In conclusion, I mean, a good one to read. For me, a harder one to read. I mean, it just the difference in years. I mean, it's obviously the oldest book we've read this year, the most intellectually stimulating and challenging, but I think that they're important to read, and this one in particular, especially for the impact it's had on the world we're in now. So yeah, I mean, not like my favorite book that I've read this year, but for 2017, but an important one. What about you?
It's a book that's worth revisiting periodically. It is truly one of the great classics, not just of Western history. I mean, this is interacting with Eastern traditions as well of the time. I mean, I guess Western relative to West is a relative thing, but this is one of the great books in human history, and is something that I agree with Popova that this is the sort of thing that everyone in government should have to read. And it's the sort of thing that should be taught in every school. There's no reason that a seventh grader couldn't read this and basically understand everything in here in large measure, provided there were a few notes on a couple of the more obscure little references or whatever. But it's so valuable to be able to read this, and it's one of those things that I'm of the view that reading the old books is often a good antidote against the particular fashions of our time, and this is one of the great old books of world history. So, cannot emphasize the importance of this one enough. Yeah, that's going to do it for us today. You know where to find us. We're at booksoftitans.com, Instagram, and Twitter. And next week we will be back with something. We're not quite sure yet, but I've been reading a couple books that are not on the Tim Ferriss suggested list. A few of the 26 that are not in that list. So I could talk a little bit about those, or by that point I may have the next one ready. Jason, what are you currently reading? Several things. Mostly trying to finish a couple of the books for the world religions class that I'm teaching. But once I finish those, I don't even remember what the other one that I'm working on right now is. So, yeah, I'm finishing that book review that I was working on the last episode. So we're finishing the book review on Peter's Halachic Nightmare, and should be finished with that here within about 15 hours or so, and I will be glad to be done with that so that I can get on to other things. But yeah, mostly stuff connected to teaching, and then I'll be able to read plenty once I'm done with all that.
Cool. Well, I've got actually I will have a Books of Titans one completed by next week, I think. But right now I'm reading Running with the Devil by Noel Monk, and he was the manager of Van Halen, and the book is about the early years of Van Halen, their first 7 years, and they're my favorite band, and so I'm learning more about them. And so it's been an interesting book, a really sad book on a lot of fronts, a lot of really good business information, actually. So it's been an enjoyable book, but yeah, the next one after that is Norse mythology by Neil Gaiman, who was the author of the Graveyard Book, one of Ferris's favorites. So I'm looking forward to reading that one next.
All right, well, I guess we can wrap there. So we'll go ahead and give our little outro. Keep reading, keep listening, keep improving,
and keep it real.
I made this.